For me, one of the attractions of reflecting on the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is this. It affirms and reminds me of the utter and ultimate mystery of what God is, irreducibly three, yet irreducibly one as well. And it helps me get away from that picture of God as some sort of angry judge or angry old man, a cosmic figure, a cosmic judge who is looking down on us as a kind of anthropomorphic father figure. There is, of course, fatherhood in God, I'm not denying, but there is also the ultimate utter mystery. And, of course, if I say mystery, that doesn't mean something meaningless and spooky and superstitious. What I mean by mystery is something that we can see patterns of, but we cannot penetrate utterly. We can see it in the way it is reflected in the world. We can make some sense of it. And I want to try and make sense of the doctrine of the Trinity insofar as one can by looking at it from two angles. First, very briefly, seeing one of the ways in which it is reflected in patterns in the created order, particularly in maths and geometry. Maths has been called many times the language of God, and I think that is for a reason. For if you consider the concept of threeness, it is a very crucial, very interesting, and actually very mysterious one in the way number and shape work. For if you consider a point, a line, where 2 points are joined together, you have something that is very basic, some basic aspect of reality. But once you add a third point, you have created a plane, the concept of the triangle. And I think this is a very powerful idea where something new and something a lot richer is introduced, something which introduces the idea of a plane in reality. And then yet further, of course, in addition to the 2 dimensions, we have at least 3, and the third dimension creates the idea of shape, of solidity, of giving form to the basic plane that we can see with our eyes on a piece of paper. And it is in this idea of threeness that I think something very important can be understood, can be appreciated by the ultimate reality of God in God's threeness, God's triad, God's Trinity. And the second thing is to go back to the Bible, to look at the scriptural origins of this idea. Now, I know that a lot of Greek fathers later, influenced no doubt by the Platonic style education that they will all have had and using Greek ideas, but also informed very strongly by the Jewish source of biblical witness, they did come up with some fairly abstruse ideas of how to explain and how to understand what is meant by God as Trinity. But I don't think they were doing their speculations, if you like, their attempts to make sense of it, in a complete vacuum. They were constantly looking back to the scriptural witness, because I think that the idea of the Trinity actually starts from trying to make sense of the experience of the first followers of Jesus, what they were trying to make sense of, their understanding, if you like, of what Jesus meant to them. And to try to make sense of this, I'm going to divide the whole Bible, not into the Old Testament and the New Testament, but actually into 3. And starting with the Old Testament, the elder law, the original revelation of God to the Jewish people, we have very much at least 2 ideas. I mean, there's a lot more going on as well. And the first one is of a God who cannot be captured in any human form, in any physical form, who is in that sense very distant, also very close to his people, but distant in the sense of being outside the creation that he's brought into being. And this is the idea that later develops, I suppose, into what one could call monotheism. But at the same time, God is expressed through spirit, and it is the Spirit of God which is variously described as nefesh or ruach or shekinah, all of which bring out slightly different aspects of what is meant by God's work in the world. It is this spirit that gives life to the world, and also is the way that God communicates, primarily through the prophets, but also in other ways as well. So the idea of God expressing God's self through spirit is one that is there in the Jewish witness. And then we have the followers of Jesus, very Jewish, purely Jewish, who feel constrained to proclaim that in the human life of Jesus, the full power and reality of the Creator God is expressed in this focused human form. And while trying to hang on to their belief in the one Creator God and not to collapse into some sort of idolatry of worshipping divine humans, which was very commonplace among surrounding nations, particularly in the Greek world, these very Jewish followers of Jesus still feel constrained to offer him the worship that is due to God alone, at least after the resurrection, and possibly, as some scholars think, even before that as well, during Jesus' actual earthly life. And that, I suppose, is the second bit of the Bible, the earthly life of Jesus as he walked on the roads of Palestine. But the third part of the Bible can, I suppose, be understood by looking centrally at the Acts of the Apostles, though the epistles, the letters which surround it, and I suppose to a certain extent the book of Revelation too, also reflect this idea that the Spirit of God continues to work in the hearts and lives of Jesus' followers, even when Jesus has ceased to be physically and temporally in time on the timeline available to his followers after his resurrection. And the belief here is that this Spirit of God, the full power and essence of God guiding the lives of Jesus' followers, is also, without remainder, the Spirit of Jesus. And so you have the idea that God is not only the Creator God who starts everything off and has plans for his people, plans for the world, which are expressed through God's Spirit in the Old Testament, but also these plans become focused on the human face of God, God living for a time on earth in an earthly form, in a visible physical form as Jesus. And as a physical, visible form of God as Jesus walking upon the earth is necessarily going to be limited to an historical time and place, for anything else would be utterly incomprehensible and utterly, well, it would just be simply weird to have the physical human Jesus continuing to live immortally on earth in exactly the same form of a first century Palestinian rabbi. When that time, that period comes to an end, it is surely important and appropriate that the power and spirit of Jesus, which is also the power and spirit of God, continues to guide the lives of Jesus' followers. And there you have, it seems to me, in a very simple form really, the origin of the doctrine of the Trinity. And why is it such an important and such a precious doctrine? I find it a deeply precious and important one. And it sometimes makes me sad that people think of it as something odd and difficult and try to avoid its implications. It's very important to me because it gives a very complete picture, insofar as we can understand it, of what God must be and what God does for us. So we have the awesome cosmic creator God. We have the human face of God, which we can understand, that we can read the records of in the Gospels and the reflections of his followers. And also we have the Spirit of God, which is also the Spirit of guidance, of Jesus, continuing to guide and to work with us in our hearts, no longer bound by time or space, but who can continue to help us live according to the message of Jesus, to make God a reality in our lives and to see the invisible power and love of God wherever we can encounter it. And this is an idea that makes an awful lot of sense to me, and it's also something that I find deeply not only inspiring but also comforting, because the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, is with us in our hearts as long as we open ourselves to it and continue to pray and try to live by the law of love, which, as the fathers used to say, is the ultimate bond that holds the Trinity of Father, Creator, Son, Redeemer, and Holy Spirit, the Spirit of both Father and Son, together in the life of the world and beyond.